I knew something was wrong the moment my father asked me to bring my phone to the table. It was New Year's Eve, the kind of night my parents liked to perform for. The house glowed with warm light and expensive decorations, everything arranged to suggest harmony and success. My mother poured the wine herself, careful not to spill a drop. My sister laughed too loudly, already talking about her plans for the year ahead, as if the future were something that could be claimed simply by wanting it badly enough. Then I saw the screen. My father's hands rested on a laptop that wasn't his. My mother slid a thin folder across the table and smiled, saying something about paperwork about starting the year clean. On the display, unmistakable even from across the table, was my bank's login page. My name. My account. They were entering information I had never given them, documents I had never signed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice or knock the laptop away. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip of red wine, and smiled as if nothing unusual was happening. Because they didn't know that the moment those forged credentials went through a silent security alert had already been triggered. They didn't know the bank was watching every keystroke. And they certainly didn't know who else would be notified next. At that table, surrounded by my own family, the outcome was already set. They just hadn't realized it yet. The room smelled like roasted meat and polished wood, familiar and comforting in the way childhood homes often are, even when they've never truly been safe. Outside, fireworks cracked in the distance, celebrating a new beginning that felt strangely irrelevant to what was unfolding in front of me. My mother kept talking, filling the silence with stories about neighbors and resolutions, her voice smooth and practiced. My sister sat across from me, twisting the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. She looked nervous in a way she tried to disguise as excitement. Every few minutes she glanced at my father, then back at the laptop. It was a look I recognized. Anticipation mixed with entitlement. No one asked me for permission. That part had already passed. "Can you unlock your phone?" My father asked casually, not looking at me. "Just in case we need to verify something." I set my phone on the table face down and shook my head. "There's nothing to verify." The air shifted. My mother's smile tightened just slightly. "It's just a formality," she said. "This is about planning. About family. Family." The word landed the way it always had, heavy and loaded, meant to end conversations rather than start them. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply took another sip of wine and watched. On the screen, the cursor blinked patiently in the password field. I felt oddly calm. Not numb, not detached, just clear. There had been a time when a moment like this would have sent my heart racing, when I would have scrambled to defend myself, to justify why my money was mine, why my boundaries mattered. That version of me would have been shaking. This version sat still. "Your sister needs stability." My mother continued, her tone softening as she reached for my sister's hand. "You're doing well. You always have. This is just helping her get started." My sister nodded, eyes shining. "It's not like I'm asking for everything," she said. "Just enough to breathe. Enough. It was always enough until it wasn't." My father cleared his throat. "We'll make it quick." He pressed enter. For a moment, nothing happened. The laptop hummed quietly, the way it does when it's thinking, when systems in distant buildings are processing information. My parents leaned forward, already relaxing. My sister exhaled, a small smile forming at the corner of her mouth. I set my glass down and folded my hands in my lap. As they waited for confirmation, I thought about how strange it was that this felt less like a betrayal and more like a conclusion. As if something that had been building for years had finally reached its natural end. This dinner hadn't been an attempt to reconnect. It hadn't been about forgiveness or celebration. It had been about access. The screen froze. The cursor disappeared. My sister frowned and tapped the trackpad. My father muttered under his breath, irritation creeping into his voice. "What's it doing?" my mother asked. I didn't answer. I looked around the table at the people who had raised me, who had taught me that being dependable was the same as being good, that silence was kindness, that giving up a little more each time was what love required. I realized with a clarity that surprised me that this was the last moment they would see me as a daughter. After tonight, I would be something else entirely. The laptop screen flickered, and the color drained from my sister's face. My parents leaned in closer, confusion replacing confidence. I felt no urge to explain, no need to intervene. Whatever happened next was no longer mine to control. I picked up my glass again, the wine cool against my fingers, and waited. It hadn't started at the bank. It never does. Long before passwords and balances and alerts, there had been roles, fixed ones. Roles that didn't change no matter how old we got or how much evidence piled up that they should. In my family, there was the one who was protected and the one who was expected to endure. I learned which one I was before I learned long division. My sister had always been described in soft language, sensitive, creative, finding herself. When she cried, it meant something important had been damaged. When she failed, it was because the world hadn't given her a fair chance. My parents spoke about her like she was made of glass, beautiful and fragile, something that had to be handled carefully, or it might shatter. I was described differently: responsible, mature for my age, independent. Those words sounded like compliments, but they came with expectations attached. If I struggled, it was because I was strong enough to handle it. If I wanted something, it was framed as optional. If I needed help, it was usually postponed until it disappeared on its own. I understood early that outcomes were decided before events ever happened. If my sister wanted something, I had the conversation wasn't about fairness. It was about keeping the peace. If she needed attention on a day that was supposed to be mine, my parents acted as if my disappointment was the real problem. I learned to want less because wanting less made life easier for everyone else. The favoritism wasn't loud or cruel. It was systematic. It showed up in patterns. Who got comforted first? Who was believed? Who was excused? My sister's emotions were treated like emergencies. Mine were treated like inconveniences that would pass if ignored. By the time I was old enough to understand money, I had already internalized the lesson. I didn't ask for much. I saved quietly. I learned to rely on myself because it was the only way to be sure something wouldn't be taken away. The first time money entered the equation, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt reasonable. I had started earning a little of my own, and my parents talked about it with a mix of pride and relief. They praised my work ethic, my discipline, the way I had my life together. Then almost casually they mentioned that my sister was struggling, that she needed help, that family stepped in when one of its own fell behind. It wasn't presented as a request so much as a conclusion. Of course I would help. Of course I understood. Of course I didn't want to be the reason things got harder for her. I said yes the first time. They called it an emergency, but the urgency vanished the moment the money changed hands. There was no follow-up, no plan to pay it back, no acknowledgement of what it had cost me. When I asked about it later, my mother waved it away. "You make more now," she said, as if that erased the principle of it. As if my effort mattered less because I had survived. That was when I noticed the shift. After that, the requests didn't start with questions. They started with assumptions. If my sister needed something, my parents looked to me first, not because I was closest, because I was reliable, because I would feel guilty enough to comply. Over time, money stopped being something I earned and became something they expected access to. They asked for account details just in case. They framed shared information as trust. When I hesitated, they reminded me that we were family, that secrets were unhealthy, that I was being dramatic. I compromised in small ways. I told myself it was easier than fighting, that nothing bad would happen if I stayed involved, that keeping everyone calm was worth the discomfort in my stomach. It wasn't. The first time I said no, truly no, the reaction shocked me. There was no discussion, no attempt to understand my reasons. There was accusation. My parents told me I was changing, that success had made me cold. My sister cried and said she didn't recognize me anymore. Suddenly, I wasn't the dependable one. I was selfish, ungrateful, difficult. It was then that I realized something fundamental. Refusing didn't end the pressure. It changed the strategy. When I was silent, they took it as consent. When I agreed, they took it as precedent. When I resisted, they took it as betrayal. There was no version of this where my needs mattered as much as my usefulness. So I learned to be quiet again. Not out of fear, but observation. I watched how conversations shifted when money was mentioned. I noticed how my parents spoke about me to others, praising my achievements while subtly positioning me as a resource. I saw how my sister talked about her plans as if my support were already included, already budgeted. By then, I understood the pattern clearly. Love in my family wasn't unconditional. It was transactional. My sister was valued for how she made them feel. I was valued for what I could provide. That realization hurt more than any argument ever had, not because it was new, but because it finally made everything make sense. I wasn't less loved. I was needed differently. And being needed meant being used. By the time I became fully independent with my own accounts and my own life, my family didn't see a daughter building something for herself. They saw a safety net pulling away, a source of stability that was no longer within easy reach. They didn't panic right away. They adapted. They softened their language, framed their expectations as concern, as shared responsibility. But underneath it all was the same assumption they had always held, that what was mine would be available when they decided it was. Sitting at that New Year's table, watching them log into my account without hesitation, I understood that nothing about this night was spontaneous. It was simply the next step in a pattern that had been forming my entire life. And for the first time, I didn't feel confused or guilty or afraid. I felt prepared. I didn't confront them after that realization. I didn't announce boundaries or deliver speeches about respect. I did what I had learned to do best in that family. I went quiet. But this time, silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. I stopped volunteering information. I answered questions with fewer details. When my parents asked how work was going, I said it was busy. When my sister hinted about needing help, I said I was focused on my own plans. I didn't accuse them of anything because accusation would have given them something to argue with. Instead, I watched. What surprised me most was how quickly they noticed the change. My mother started calling more often, her voice sweet and concerned. She asked if everything was okay, if I seemed stressed, if I was still happy. My father sent messages framed as advice, reminding me how important it was to stick together, especially as the year was ending. My sister sent links and screenshots, not asking outright for money, but laying out her problems like breadcrumbs I was expected to follow. None of it was aggressive. That was the point. Pressure in my family had never been applied directly. It seeped in disguised as care. I began to see how predictable it all was. Every conversation followed the same arc: warmth first, then concern, then obligation. And finally, if I resisted disappointment heavy enough to make me feel cruel for protecting myself. Instead of reacting, I started preparing. I told myself I was being reasonable. Adults took precautions. People planned for unlikely outcomes all the time. Insurance wasn't paranoia. Locks weren't accusations. And if nothing ever happened, no one would be hurt by the fact that I had been careful. The first thing I did was separate my life from theirs in ways they couldn't see. I reviewed every account, every shared detail, every place where my information intersected with theirs. It was tedious work, the kind that forces you to look closely at assumptions you didn't even realize you'd made. I changed how statements were delivered. I updated contact information. I removed old addresses that no longer applied. Each step felt small, almost insignificant, but together they created distance. Quiet, invisible distance. What struck me was how normal it all felt. This wasn't dramatic. This was what independence actually looked like when it wasn't filtered through guilt. At the same time, I started documenting things. Not in a dramatic way, not like I was building a case. I simply wrote things down. Dates, conversations, requests. I saved messages instead of deleting them. I kept notes after calls, brief summaries of what had been said and how it had been framed. At first it felt excessive. Then it felt grounding. When I put things on paper, patterns became undeniable. I could see how often money entered conversations that were supposed to be about feelings. I could see how my sister's emergencies clustered around moments when I had just shared good news about my own life. I could see how my parents' language shifted depending on whether they were speaking to me privately or describing me to others. Writing it down took the edge off the confusion. It was harder to gaslight myself when the words were there in black and white. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. There was no need. Documentation wasn't a weapon. It was clarity. The final step was the hardest to admit, even to myself. I signed up for additional monitoring on my accounts, enhanced security, identity protection, alerts that would trigger if something unusual happened. It wasn't about expecting a crime. It was about acknowledging pressure. Pressure makes people impatient. Impatience makes people sloppy. I configured everything carefully. No dramatic notifications. No visible barriers that would provoke questions. The systems I chose worked quietly in the background, responding only if someone crossed a line that was clear and objective. I didn't want control. I wanted neutrality. The irony wasn't lost on me. I trusted systems more than promises, software more than family assurances. But systems didn't take offense when you said no. They didn't reinterpret boundaries as betrayal. Through all of this, I still hoped none of it would matter. I hoped the tension would fade, that my parents would adjust to the idea that I wasn't a backup plan, that my sister would find her footing without leaning on me. Hope is stubborn like that. It lingers even when evidence suggests it shouldn't. But I also made one decision I didn't write down anywhere. There was a line I would not cross again. I would discuss money, I would listen, I would empathize. I would even help in ways that didn't compromise my autonomy. But I would never again allow access. Not to my accounts, not to my identity, not to decisions that belonged to me alone. I didn't announce this rule. I didn't threaten consequences. I simply held it quietly like a locked door whose existence only becomes obvious when someone tries to open it. As the year drew to a close, the pressure intensified. Invitations became more insistent. Conversations circled more tightly around planning and future security. My parents talked about starting fresh, about doing things the right way this time. My sister spoke about the coming year as if it were a shared project, something we would all invest in together. I listened. I nodded. I didn't commit. By the time New Year's approached, I understood something with unsettling clarity. When people are used to unlimited access, the moment that access disappears, they don't ask why. They panic. And panic, I had learned, made people reckless. The warning didn't come as a confrontation. It came as a question that didn't quite make sense. My father called me one afternoon, his tone unusually careful. He asked whether I had moved any accounts recently. Not accusing, not demanding. Curious. As if the idea had just occurred to him and unsettled something he hadn't expected to feel. I told him I'd made some routine updates. Nothing dramatic. He paused, then laughed lightly, and said it was smart to stay organized. The conversation moved on, but the silence that followed felt heavier than anything he'd said. After that, the invitations started. My mother suggested dinner more than once, always framed as casual. Just us. No agenda. She mentioned how important it was to start the year together, how families needed rituals, especially after a difficult year. My sister sent messages about recipes she wanted to try, about resolutions she was excited about how nice it would be to have everyone in one place. None of it was urgent. That was the point. Urgency would have revealed too much. Still, something in their timing felt off. Conversations that had drifted for months suddenly focused on togetherness, on planning, on aligning. Words like streamlining and simplifying slipped into places they hadn't belonged before. I listened more than I spoke. When I did respond, I kept it neutral. I didn't reject the idea of dinner. I didn't accept it either. I let the space stretch. That space made them uncomfortable. My sister was the first to break. She called late one night, her voice soft, almost apologetic. She talked about feeling behind, about how hard it was to watch everyone else move forward. She didn't ask for money. She didn't need to. The implication hung between us, familiar and practiced. I told her I understood how overwhelming things could feel. I didn't offer solutions. She went quiet, then laughed awkwardly and said she didn't mean to dump everything on me. She changed the subject quickly. When we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at my phone, thinking about how often concern had been used as a test. The real shift came a week later. My mother mentioned paperwork. She said it casually, as if it were an afterthought. Something about old documents, about wanting to make sure everything was in order before the year turned. She said she'd found some things while cleaning things that might need clarification. She asked if I could bring my laptop to dinner just in case. I felt the warning land fully then. Not fear. Recognition. This wasn't about organization. It was about access. I asked what kind of paperwork she meant. She waved it off. Nothing complicated. Just forms. Just planning. She reminded me how good I was with details, how helpful it would be to have me there. Helpful. The word pressed against that internal line I'd drawn months earlier. I told her I wasn't comfortable signing anything or reviewing financial documents at a family dinner. My voice stayed calm, neutral. The silence on the other end of the line was sharp enough to cut. My father picked up the extension. He said I was overthinking it, that no one was asking me to sign anything, that it was just about understanding where things stood as a family. He said my sister needed reassurance, that starting the year united mattered. I said I could come to dinner without my laptop. The tone shifted immediately. They didn't argue. They adjusted. My mother said of course that she understood, that she never meant to pressure me. My father joked about how serious I'd become. My sister sent a cheerful message later that night, complete with emojis telling me she was excited to see me. It was seamless, almost impressive. That was when I knew for certain they had already decided what they wanted. The dinner wasn't the question. It was the setting. In the days leading up to New Year's, I noticed small things. My father asked again whether I'd changed passwords recently, this time framing it as concern about security. My mother asked whether I still used the same phone. My sister asked what bank I preferred, now saying she was thinking about switching. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. They weren't asking me to participate. They were gathering information. I agreed to dinner. Not because I trusted them, but because I wanted to see how far they would go when they believed they were close to what they wanted. Avoidance would only delay the inevitable. Observation required proximity. I prepared quietly. I charged my phone. I made sure the monitoring systems were active. I reviewed my notes not to memorize them, but to remind myself that what I felt wasn't imagined. On the evening of New Year's Eve, I drove to my parents' house under a sky already cracking with distant fireworks. The street looked the same as it always had, neat and well lit, the kind of place that made people assume stability lived behind every door. Inside, everything was staged to perfection. Music played softly, candles flickered. The table was set with intention. My mother hugged me a little too tightly. My father kissed my cheek and commented on how grown up I looked. My sister greeted me with exaggerated warmth, her smile bright and brittle. We talked about harmless things at first: food, weather, resolutions. My parents poured wine generously, refilling glasses before they were empty. The mood was almost convincing. Almost. I noticed the laptop on the side table before we sat down. Not mine. Already open. Already charged. When we moved to the dining table, my father brought it closer, placing it within reach as if it belonged there. My mother set a thin folder beside his plate. My sister avoided my eyes, focusing instead on arranging her napkin. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. As we ate, the conversation began to circle. Not directly. Never directly. My parents talked about how complicated finances had become, how confusing online systems were, how helpful it was to have someone competent involved. They praised me again, highlighting my reliability, my success, my discipline. Each compliment felt like a hook wrapped in velvet. When my mother finally mentioned starting the year clean, it sounded rehearsed. When my father suggested we just take a look at a few things after dinner, it was framed as inevitable. I nodded. I smiled. I drank my wine slowly and waited. By the time dessert was cleared, I knew exactly what was coming. And I knew exactly what I would not give them. I had hoped I would never need the protections I put in place. At the time, they felt almost embarrassing, like preparing for a storm that might never come. I told myself I was being cautious, not suspicious, responsible, not afraid. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I had learned over years of quiet observation that the people who knew me best were also the ones most likely to overstep. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce new rules or explain my reasoning. I didn't say, "This is a boundary now." Boundaries in my family had always been treated like challenges. Instead, I made changes that didn't require permission or discussion. I reclaimed my financial privacy piece by piece. I reviewed every account I had ever opened, every service that had my information, every place where my past still lingered in the form of an old address or a shared detail. I updated contact information. I moved statements to secure digital delivery. I closed access points that had once felt harmless because they had been convenient. None of it was dramatic. It was administrative. The kind of work adults are expected to do when they take responsibility for their own lives. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my sister. There was nothing to explain. If they no longer had access, it was because access was no longer appropriate. That was all. What struck me most was how invisible these changes were. Days passed, then weeks. No one mentioned anything. No one asked questions. It would have been easy to believe that my concerns had been misplaced, that the pressure I felt existed only in my head. Then the comments started. My mother asked casually if I'd changed banks, saying she couldn't remember which one I used anymore. My father mentioned online security, joking about how complicated everything had become. My sister complained about forgetting passwords and laughed about how impossible it was to keep track of details these days. They weren't asking. They were testing. I didn't react. I answered lightly. I let the conversations drift. Each small probe confirmed what I already knew. The moment something shifted, they noticed. They always did. Around that time, I started documenting more deliberately, not obsessively, just clearly. If money came up in conversation, I made a note of how it was framed. If someone implied expectation instead of asking, I wrote it down. If a message felt manipulative but subtle enough to deny later, I saved it. At first, the habit felt cold. Then it felt grounding. When things were written down, they stopped swirling in my head. I didn't have to rely on memory or emotion. I could look at the facts and trust them. Documentation didn't inflame anything. It clarified it. I wasn't building a case. I was building perspective. The final step was the hardest to justify even to myself. I enrolled in enhanced monitoring services tied to my accounts. Identity protection. Fraud alerts. Systems designed to notice patterns humans miss. I configured them carefully, setting thresholds that made sense. No hair-trigger reactions. No unnecessary alarms. Just quiet oversight. Everything ran automatically. I didn't want control. I wanted objectivity. If nothing ever happened, these systems would remain invisible, forgotten in the background of a life that moved on peacefully. That was the outcome I preferred. I hoped for it. But I also knew something else. Pressure changes people. And when pressure doesn't work, People look for shortcuts. I trusted systems more than promises because systems didn't reinterpret my boundaries as personal attacks. They didn't take offense. They didn't negotiate. They responded only to behavior. During all of this, I kept my internal rule firmly in place. I would discuss money. I would listen. I would empathize. I would even help in ways that didn't compromise my autonomy. But I would never again allow unauthorized access to my identity or my finances. That line wasn't open for debate. I didn't share this rule. I didn't warn anyone. Rules don't work if you have to announce them to people who benefit from breaking them. As New Year's approached, the atmosphere shifted again. Invitations became more frequent. Conversations circled more tightly around planning and the future. My parents talked about the importance of unity, about how starting the year aligned mattered more than ever. My sister spoke about her plans as if they were shared goals, something we would all invest in together. I listened. I nodded. I didn't commit. I noticed how discomfort crept in when I didn't fill silences, how quickly reassurance turned into impatience, how often the same points were repeated as if repetition itself might wear me down. It didn't. For the first time in my life, I felt calm in the face of it. Not numb, not detached, just steady. I realized something that surprised me. Preparation had given me peace. I wasn't rehearsing arguments. I wasn't imagining worst-case scenarios. I wasn't waiting for the next demand with dread in my chest. I had done what I could quietly and reasonably, and whatever happened next would not be the result of my inaction. By the time I agreed to come to dinner, I wasn't hoping for reconciliation. I wasn't bracing for disaster either. I was simply ready to observe. Because when people are used to unlimited access, the moment that access disappears, they don't negotiate. They panic. And panic, I had learned, made people reckless. I just hadn't expected how quickly they would prove it. Dinner resumed as if nothing had happened. My mother served the main course with deliberate cheer, setting plates down, carefully asking if everyone had enough. My father topped off glasses. His movements practiced his smile just a little too fixed. My sister focused on her food, nodding at the right moments, laughing when it was expected of her. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen a family easing into the night, comfortable and familiar. But I could feel the waiting. Conversation moved in circles. Weather, neighbors, a distant relative's divorce. The kind of harmless filler my parents used when they wanted time to pass without actually passing. I noticed my father checking the clock on the wall more than once. I noticed my mother glance at the folder beside his plate, then away again. My sister barely touched her drink. They weren't improvising. They were counting beats. Eventually, my mother leaned back in her chair and sighed, the sound soft but intentional. "It's been such a strange year," she said. "So much uncertainty. I think we all just want a little stability going forward." There it was. Not a demand. Not yet. Just a door opened. My father nodded, especially with everything being so digital now. It's harder to keep track of things. Accounts, paperwork, all of it. He looked at me, then warm and approving. "You've always been good with that kind of thing." I smiled politely. "I manage my own accounts just fine." My sister shifted in her seat. "I wish I had your brain," she said lightly. "You always seem so put together." Put together. Another compliment that carried an expectation underneath it. My mother reached for her wine and took a slow sip. "It's nice when families can rely on each other," she said. "When things don't feel so separate." I set my fork down and met her eyes. Separate isn't always a bad thing. The pause that followed was subtle, but it landed. My father cleared his throat. "We're not saying you shouldn't be independent," he said quickly. "Just that sometimes it makes sense to streamline, to make sure everyone's on the same page." My sister leaned forward. "It would just be temporary," she said. "Until I get my footing." I nodded once. "I'm not comfortable with that." The words were calm, neutral. I didn't raise my voice or add explanation. I didn't justify myself. I simply said no. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. My mother's smile slipped just for a second before she recovered. "Honey," she said, "no one is asking you to give anything up. We're talking about helping your sister plan her future." "I understand," I said, and my answer is still no. My sister's eyes flashed. "So that's it?" she asked. "You're just going to sit there and say no, I am?" My father's tone hardened. "You're being unnecessarily rigid. I'm being clear." My mother set her glass down a little too firmly. "You've changed," she said. "You used to care about family." There it was. The accusation wrapped as observation. "I still do," I said. "That doesn't mean I owe access to my finances." My sister laughed, sharp and humorless. "Listen to yourself," she said. "You talk like a lawyer." I shrugged. "I talk like an adult." The air in the room shifted again, this time unmistakably. The warmth drained out of their voices, replaced by something brittle. "You don't trust us," my mother said quietly. "This isn't about trust," I replied. "It's about boundaries." My father shook his head. "Boundaries," he repeated as if tasting the word. "Families don't work that way." "They should," I said. My sister pushed her chair back slightly, frustration bleeding through her composure. "You have everything," she snapped. "A career, savings, security. I'm just trying to survive." "And I'm not stopping you from surviving," I said. "I'm stopping myself from being responsible for it." My mother inhaled sharply. "Do you hear how selfish that sounds?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silent stretch, felt the weight of it settle on the table between us. "What's selfish," I said finally, "is assuming my refusal is an attack." My father's jaw tightened. "We're trying to do this the easy way." I met his gaze. "There isn't an easy way." For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of cutlery clinking from a neighbor's house drifted through the window. Fireworks popped faintly in the distance. Then my mother smiled. It wasn't warm, it wasn't reassuring, it was controlled. "Fine," she said. "We'll talk about it later." The way she said later made my stomach drop. My sister stood and cleared her plate, her movements abrupt. "I need some air," she muttered, grabbing her phone and heading toward the living room. My father exhaled slowly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I'm making it honest," I said. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the folder, slid it a few inches closer to himself, and then stopped as if reconsidering. Dinner ended awkwardly. Dessert was offered but barely touched. The earlier warmth never returned. My parents avoided my eyes. My sister didn't come back to the table. As I stood to help clear dishes, my mother waved me off. "Don't worry about it," she said. Her tone clipped. "You've done enough." I nodded and picked up my coat. As I moved toward the door, I caught my father's reflection in the darkened window. He wasn't watching me. He was watching the laptop. That was when it hit me. They hadn't abandoned their plan. They had simply stopped asking for my cooperation. And in the quiet that followed my refusal, I understood something with absolute certainty. This dinner wasn't over. It had just shifted from persuasion to action. They didn't stop when I said no. The house settled into a strange, brittle quiet after dinner, the kind that pretends to be calm while everything underneath it tightens. My mother moved dishes to the sink with unnecessary force. My father stayed seated, scrolling on his phone, his jaw set. My sister returned from the living room carrying her own laptop, placing it on the table as if it belonged there. No one explained why it was out. No one asked if that was okay. "We don't need to drag this out," my father said, still not looking at me. "We've already done most of the work." That was the first crack in the story they'd been telling themselves. I paused with my coat half on. "What work?" my mother answered instead. "Just getting organized. You know how complicated things can get when accounts aren't aligned." Aligned. The word landed with a dull thud. My sister opened the laptop. It booted quickly, already charged. She didn't glance at me when the screen lit up. Her fingers moved with confidence that felt rehearsed. "You said you weren't comfortable," she said lightly, eyes fixed on the keyboard. "So we figured we'd handle it." I stepped closer to the table. On the screen, a familiar login page loaded. My bank. My name already filled in. My throat tightened, but my voice stayed even. "You don't have permission to do that." My father finally looked up. "We're family. That doesn't grant access." My sister sighed dramatically. "God, you're acting like we're robbing a stranger." I watched her type information that should have been private. Old answers. Old data. Things I hadn't realized they'd memorized over the years because I'd never imagined I would need to protect them. "Stop," I said. "This is illegal." My mother turned her expression sharp. "Don't be ridiculous. We're not stealing anything." "You're accessing my account without consent," I replied. "That's a crime." My father scoffed. "You always go to extremes." I felt a familiar urge to explain, to justify, to soften my words so they would land more gently. I let it pass. "I'm telling you clearly," I said. "If you proceed, there will be consequences." My sister laughed. Not nervously, confidently. "You're not going to call the police on us." "I don't have to," I said. That was when she finally looked up, meeting my eyes with something like triumph. "You don't control everything." She hit enter. For a moment, nothing happened. The screen loaded the familiar spinning icon, mocking the gravity of what she'd just done. My parents leaned forward instinctively, their earlier frustration dissolving into anticipation. "I'm in," my sister said, her voice bright. "See, no big deal." My mother exhaled a breath she'd been holding. "Thank God," she murmured. "This would have been so much easier if you'd just trusted us." I didn't respond. I watched. My sister navigated through menus with unsettling ease. Balances appeared. Numbers I recognized displayed on a screen that no longer felt private. My father whistled softly. "Look at that," he said. "You really are doing well." My sister's eyes shone. "This is enough," she said. "This fixes everything." "Don't," I said quietly. She rolled her eyes. "Relax. We're just moving things around." "Unauthorized transfers trigger federal alerts," I said. "You're using forged access." My mother snapped. "Enough with the scare tactics." "This isn't a tactic," I said. "It's a warning." My sister hovered her hand over the trackpad. "You're always so dramatic." "I'm being precise." She grinned, the expression sharp and victorious. "Watch me." She clicked into the transfer screen. Time stretched in a strange way, as if the room had thickened. I noticed details that shouldn't have mattered. The hum of the refrigerator, the flicker of candlelight against the wall, the faint crack of fireworks outside celebrating a moment that no longer belonged to me. My father loosened his tie. "Make it quick." My sister typed in an amount, fingers flying. My mother leaned in, already calculating. They spoke in fragments about next steps, about plans, about relief. I stayed where I was, hands at my sides, heart steady. "Last chance," I said. "If you do this, it's out of my hands." My sister looked up at me, her smile daring. "You don't scare me." She pressed enter. For a heartbeat, the screen stayed the same. My parents relaxed, already moving into celebration mode. My mother reached for the wine bottle. My father laughed under his breath. Then the screen flickered. The color drained away, replaced by a harsh red glow that seemed too bright for the room. Text appeared bold and unmistakable, spanning the screen. My sister's smile vanished. "What is that?" she asked. The laptop emitted a sharp tone, not loud but insistent. My father stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "Why is it red?" my mother whispered. I exhaled slowly. "That," I said, "is what happens when you don't need my permission anymore." Panic erupted instantly. My sister slammed the trackpad, refreshing, clicking, trying to undo something that could not be undone. My mother grabbed the laptop, her hands shaking as she scanned the message. My father demanded explanations that no one could give him. "Fix it!" My mother hissed at me. Do something! I shook my head. I warned you. My sister's face crumpled. You set us up. No, I said. You walked in. Outside sirens wailed faintly in the distance, not yet close enough to belong to us. Inside, the illusion finally collapsed. I watched my family scramble, their confidence evaporating as they realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, their choices, not mine, would determine what happened next. The room went unnaturally quiet after the screen turned red. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows shouting. It was heavier than that, like the air itself had decided to stop moving. My sister froze with her hand still hovering over the trackpad, her fingers curled as if they could somehow pull the moment back. My mother stood beside her wine bottle, forgotten on the table, her mouth slightly open. My father stared at the screen, blinking as if his eyes might be lying to him. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then my sister laughed, sharp and brittle. It's a glitch, she said too quickly. These sites do that sometimes. She clicked refresh. Nothing changed. The red screen stayed where it was, steady and unforgiving. Lines of text remained fixed, clinical and formal, the kind of language designed not to negotiate. My mother leaned closer, squinting as if proximity might soften it. What does it say? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My father read aloud, stumbling over the words. Unauthorized access detected, transaction blocked, credentials logged. He stopped there, as if refusing to finish the sentence might keep the rest from being true. My sister's smile faded completely. That doesn't mean anything, she said. It's just a warning. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap. I felt strangely distant from my own body, as if I were watching the scene from somewhere just above it. It's automated, I said calmly. No one pushed a button. My mother turned on me. What did you do? I didn't do anything, I replied. You did. My sister slammed the laptop shut and then immediately opened it again, panic leaking through her movements. Make it go away, she said. You know how this stuff works. I told you not to proceed, I said. I told you it was traceable. My father ran a hand through his hair. You said consequences, he snapped. You didn't say this. I said it would be out of my hands. He stared at me, his face flushing. So what now, you're punishing us? I shook my head. This isn't punishment. It's protocol. The word landed badly. My sister pushed back from the table, pacing. We didn't even take anything she said. The money's still there. That has to count for something. My mother's voice rose. Call them, she said to me. Explain it was a mistake. Families make mistakes. There's no one to call, I said. That's the point. The laptop chimed softly, another notification appearing beneath the first. My sister lunged toward it, reading aloud in fragments. Additional review initiated. Activity flagged for monitoring. Her voice broke. My father sank back into his chair. This is getting blown out of proportion. I met his eyes. It's a federal system, I said evenly. It doesn't care about proportion. For the first time that night, I saw real fear move through the room. Not the fear of losing money, the fear of being seen. My mother's hands began to shake. You could have stopped this, she said, her tone turning sharp, accusatory. You could have said something. I did, I replied. Multiple times. My sister rounded on me. You wanted this, she accused. You wanted us to look like criminals. I wanted you to stop, I said. You didn't. She let out a sob that sounded more like rage than grief. You always think you're better than us. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to clarify. My father stood abruptly and started pacing, muttering under his breath about lawyers and misunderstandings and how these systems overreacted. He stopped in front of me, towering. You need to fix this. I can't, I said. And even if I could, I wouldn't. The words surprised me with how easy they were to say. My mother stared at me as if I were someone she had just met. "You're really going to let this happen," she said. I thought about all the moments that had led here. Every time I'd swallowed discomfort to keep the peace. Every time I'd been told to be the bigger person. Every time access had been taken for granted. "I'm not letting anything happen," I said. "I'm letting it finish." The laptop chimed again. My sister flinched as if it had burned her. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "It means the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do," I said. "Documenting." My father's voice cracked. "Documenting what everything?" No one moved after that. The red screen cast an eerie glow across the table, washing out the warm light my mother had worked so hard to create earlier. The house felt different now, stripped of its performance. The smell of food had gone stale. The celebration outside sounded distant and unreal. I realized then how calm I felt. Not relieved, not triumphant, just steady. For years I had carried the weight of anticipating their reactions, their needs, their expectations. I had rehearsed conversations in my head, imagined outcomes, prepared explanations that were never enough. Sitting there now, I felt that weight lift, replaced by something simpler. Certainty. My sister collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands. My mother stood rigid, staring at the screen as if she could intimidate it into compliance. My father whispered to himself, running through strategies that no longer applied. None of them looked at me anymore. That more than anything else told me the power had shifted. The red screen remained unwavering, its message unchanged. Somewhere far away, systems continued to log timestamp and store what had just happened. The process had started indifferent to pleas or explanations. I took a slow breath and leaned back in my chair. This was the moment they would remember, not because of what I did, but because of what they chose. And as the seconds ticked by, stretching into something irreversible, I understood with quiet clarity that whatever came next would not be a negotiation. It would be an outcome. They believed they had won for exactly 3 seconds. My sister straightened in her chair, smoothing her hair as if preparing for applause. My mother reached for the champagne she had chilled earlier, the cork already loosened. My father let out a breath that sounded like relief, his shoulders dropping as he glanced at the numbers on the screen one last time. "See, my sister," said, forcing a laugh. Nothing happened. The laptop didn't agree. A thin progress bar lingered where confirmation should have appeared. It didn't move. The screen didn't refresh. The room waited suspended between confidence and doubt. My sister clicked again. Then again. "It's just slow," she said, her voice tightening. "The site's probably overloaded." The bar vanished. The screen went blank for half a second, then flashed back to life in a color so harsh it felt physical. Red flooded the display, bright and unmistakable, drowning out the warm light of the dining room. Text appeared in sharp, formal lines. My mother froze mid-pour. The champagne bottle tilted forgotten, a thin stream spilling onto the tablecloth. My father took a step closer, squinting as if proximity might soften the message. My sister stared, unblinking. "What does that mean?" my mother asked. No one answered. The words were not emotional. They were not threatening. They were precise. Unauthorized access detected. Transaction blocked. Activity logged. Review initiated. My sister shook her head. "No," she said. "No, no, no." She slapped the refresh key. The red screen remained. My father leaned over her shoulder. "Click back," he ordered. "Log out." She tried. The cursor moved, but nothing responded. The laptop emitted a soft tone, almost polite, as if acknowledging the command and declining it. "This is ridiculous," my mother snapped. "It's our family account. She's just helping her sister." "It isn't a family account," I said quietly. "And helping doesn't look like this." They turned on me at once. "What did you do?" my mother demanded. "What did you set up?" "I set up protection," I said. "A long time ago." My sister stood abruptly, pacing. "You planned this," she accused. "You wanted to humiliate us." "I wanted you to stop," I said. "I told you what would happen if you didn't." My father rubbed his temples. "This is an error," he said, trying to convince himself. "Systems make mistakes. We'll call the bank." "There's no number on that screen," I said. "That's intentional." The laptop chimed again. A second line appeared beneath the first, smaller but no less final. "Additional monitoring enabled. Do not attempt further access." My sister's breath hitched. "Monitoring," she whispered. My mother's voice dropped sharp with panic. "What kind of monitoring?" I didn't raise my voice. "The kind that watches patterns," I said. "The kind that forwards them." My father looked at me, then really looked as if seeing me for the first time. "To who?" "To the people who handle this," I said. "Automatically." The word hung in the air. Automatically. My sister stopped pacing. "So, no one called anyone?" she asked, hopeful. "Not manually," I said. My mother seized on it. "Then it's fine," she said quickly. "If no one called, we can explain. We can fix this." I shook my head. "You don't explain to a system." The laptop chimed again, a little louder this time. The red screen didn't change, but the implication did. Time was passing. Records were being created. My father's confidence collapsed into urgency. "We need to leave this alone," he said. "Everyone calm down." My sister laughed, hysterical. "Calm down," she said. "My name is on that screen." "No," I corrected. "Your IP address is—" She stopped laughing. My mother grabbed the laptop, her hands shaking. "Turn it off," she ordered. "Unplug it." My father reached for the cord. I watched them scramble the way people do when they realize control has slipped beyond their grasp. "It won't help," I said. They didn't listen. The laptop went dark. For a moment, the room breathed. Then my father's phone buzzed on the table. He stared at it, unmoving. My mother's eyes darted to the screen. My sister pressed her hands to her mouth. The phone buzzed again. He picked it up with fingers that suddenly looked old. His face drained of color as he read whatever notification had appeared. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. My mother's voice trembled. "Who is it?" My father swallowed. "The bank," he said. "Their fraud department." My sister let out a sob. "They can't prove anything," she said. "We didn't take the money. They don't need to prove theft," I said. "They need to document intent." My mother rounded on me, fury cracking through the fear. "You could have stopped this," she said. "You could have warned us." "I did," I said. "You didn't listen." My father sank into his chair, staring at the dark laptop as if it had betrayed him personally. "We were just trying to help," he murmured. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not satisfaction, not anger. Acceptance. "This is what happens," I said, "when help becomes entitlement." Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Outside, fireworks exploded in brilliant color, celebrating a new year that no longer included illusions. Inside, my family sat surrounded by the consequences of their own choices, finally understanding that this was no longer a private matter to negotiate. I stood and reached for my coat. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, her voice small. "Home," I said. As I opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, sharp and clean. I paused, looking back at the table where they sat frozen, their narrative finally stripped away. The red screen wasn't there anymore. But it didn't need to be. The message had already been sent. The panic didn't explode all at once. It unraveled. My father stood in the middle of the dining room with his phone pressed to his ear, pacing in short, tight steps. My mother hovered near the table, twisting a napkin until it tore. My sister sat rigid, staring at the dark laptop as if it might turn back on and undo everything. "Say it was a mistake," my mother said to no one in particular. "Say we clicked the wrong thing." My father covered the phone and hissed, "Stop talking." He turned away from us, lowering his voice. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I understand. No, There was no transfer completed. I'm aware. Of course. Each pause felt longer than the last. My sister finally looked at me. You set us up, she said, her voice flat. You planned this. I shook my head. I planned for boundaries, I said. You crossed them. My mother snapped toward me. Don't play innocent, she said. You knew this would happen. I knew it could, I replied. That's not the same thing. My father ended the call and stared at the phone for a long moment before setting it down. They're escalating it, he said quietly. The word landed hard. Escalating what my sister asked. The review, he said. They're flagging the activity. My mother's face tightened. So call them back, she said. Explain we're family. My father didn't look at her. It doesn't work like that. For the first time, I saw it sink in. Not just that something had gone wrong, but that no one in the room could fix it. The system wasn't waiting for reassurance. It wasn't interested in context or intention. It was documenting. My sister stood abruptly and started pacing again. This is your fault, she said to me. If you hadn't been so secretive, none of this would have happened. I met her eyes. If you hadn't tried to access my account, none of this would have happened. She laughed sharp and hollow. You really think they're going to take our side over yours? I don't think there are sides anymore, I said. There's just a record. My mother rounded on me, her voice rising. We raised you, she said. We sacrificed for you, and this is how you repay us. I didn't raise my voice. You don't get repayment for raising your child, I said, and you don't get access to my life because of it. My father sank into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. You didn't have to record this, he muttered. I paused. Record what? The night he said. All of it. My sister froze. What does he mean? I reached into my pocket and set my phone on the table screen facing up. I turned on the recorder when I arrived, I said. It's been running the entire time. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother stared at the phone as if it were a weapon. You can't use that, she said. That's a betrayal. It's documentation, I replied. There's a difference. My sister shook her head slowly. You're sick, she said. You wanted proof. I wanted clarity, I said, for myself. My father looked up at me, his eyes red. Turn it off, he said. Delete it. I didn't move. No. My mother's voice dropped to a whisper. You're destroying this family. I felt something loosen in my chest, then something that had been knotted for years. No, I said. I'm refusing to be destroyed by it. My sister's panic tipped into anger. You think you're better than us, she said. You always have. I think I deserve the same respect you expect, I said. That's all. My father stood again, his shoulders sagging. They asked for everything he said quietly. Statements, access logs, IP information. My sister's face went pale. What does that mean? It means they know where it came from, I said. And how. My mother collapsed into a chair. This is a misunderstanding, she said weakly. We can explain. I looked at her. You admitted you had documents prepared, I said. You admitted you were going to move money without my consent. That's not a misunderstanding. My father closed his eyes. We were just trying to do what was best, for who I asked. He didn't answer. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had edged closer. The warmth was gone, replaced by the sterile awareness that every word spoken now could matter later. My sister's voice trembled. What happens next? I took a breath. Next, the bank does what it's required to do, I said. And I stop being part of this conversation. My mother looked up at me, tears finally spilling. You're really going to walk away? I already have, I said. I picked up my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I didn't stop the recording yet. I didn't need to. As I turned toward the door, my father spoke. You could still help us. I paused my hand on the knob. I am, I said. By not lying for you. The door closed softly behind me. Outside, the night was cold and clear. Fireworks had faded, leaving only distant echoes. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in air that felt cleaner than anything inside that house. Behind me, voices rose again, frantic and overlapping. Plans were being made. Blame was shifting. Stories were already changing. None of it involved me anymore. For the first time, the truth didn't need my protection. It could stand on its own. The aftermath didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It arrived quietly through emails, phone calls, and sealed envelopes. By morning, my father's number was already blocked on my phone, not out of anger but necessity. I needed distance to think, to breathe. The bank contacted me first, not with questions, but confirmations, access logs, timestamps, locations. Everything was documented with a precision that made the previous night feel smaller, almost irrelevant. They didn't ask me what I wanted to do. They told me what they were required to do. Accounts were temporarily restricted pending review. Internal investigations were opened. Statements were requested. The tone was calm, professional, unmistakably serious. No one raised their voice. No one accused. The system simply moved forward. That was when it became real. Not dramatic. Real. My parents tried to regain control through familiar channels. My mother left voicemails that swung wildly between tears and indignation. One minute she was devastated, begging me to call her back. The next, she was furious, accusing me of overreacting, of humiliating the family, of making things public that should have stayed private. I didn't respond. My sister texted me long messages late at night, each one contradicting the last. She said she was scared. Then she said I had always been cold. She said she didn't mean for things to go this far. Then she said I should have known better than to let it happen. I didn't respond to those either. Silence. I was learning wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Within days, the consequences began stacking up in ways they hadn't anticipated. The bank froze more than just my accounts. Questions spread outward, touching joint records, past transactions, unexplained overlaps. The illusion of compartmentalization collapsed. Actions taken casually over years suddenly had context. My father's confidence evaporated first. He called from a different number, once his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. He said they needed help understanding what was happening. He said lawyers were expensive. He said this had gone too far. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I said I can't help you, and ended the call. The social fallout followed quickly. My parents had always cared deeply about appearances, about being seen as generous, respectable, stable. News of an investigation doesn't spread loudly, but it spreads efficiently. Invitations dried up. Calls went unanswered. Friends who had once praised their parenting suddenly became distant. My sister felt it the hardest. Her plans stalled overnight. Background checks took longer than expected. Opportunities disappeared without explanation. She complained to anyone who would listen that people were being unfair, that she was being punished for a mistake. No one argued with her. They just stopped offering support. Extended family reached out to me cautiously at first. Aunts and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years wanted to know what had happened. Their questions were careful probing. They wanted reassurance that this was a misunderstanding. I gave them facts. Only facts. I shared nothing emotional. I forwarded no recordings unless asked directly. When I did, the conversations changed immediately. People went quiet. Apologies followed, awkward and delayed. No one asked me to fix things after that. The most striking change was internal. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next demand. My phone stayed silent for long stretches. My evenings belonged to me. I slept through the night without rehearsing conversations that might never happen. I secured everything fully. New passwords, new protocols, legal clarity. The systems I'd put in place did what they were meant to do, and then faded into the background again, watchful but unobtrusive. My life became smaller and steadier, defined by routines instead of emergencies. Occasionally guilt surfaced. It always did, conditioned and automatic. A voice in my head whispered that I could have softened things, explained more, stepped in sooner, that I could have sacrificed a little to spare everyone pain. Then I remembered the cost of always sacrificing first. My parents stopped calling altogether after a letter arrived from their attorney outlining the next steps. Formal language replaced emotional leverage. The shift was almost comical. Once access was gone, affection had no currency. I didn't celebrate their losses. I mourned what I had never truly had. There were moments, especially at night, when the weight of it pressed in. Not regret, but grief. Grief for the version of family I'd hoped for, the one that might have existed if love hadn't always come with conditions. I let myself feel it without trying to fix it. Grief passed. Stability remained. Weeks later, I stood in my apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor, and realized something fundamental had changed. Not around me, within me. Their power over my choices had depended entirely on access. To my money, to my time, to my willingness to explain myself. Once that access was gone, so was their influence. What remained was quiet. Not empty, peaceful. I didn't hear from my sister again, not directly. I heard about her through others, about the job she couldn't get, the friends who drifted away, the resentment she carried like armor. I wished her no harm. I wished myself no return. By the time the legal processes settled into their slow, methodical rhythm, I felt detached from the outcome. Whatever happened next would unfold without my involvement. I had given the truth space to work. That was enough. Standing at my window one evening, watching the city settle into dusk, I understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Losing their approval hurt less than living under their control ever had, and that realization, quiet and unremarkable on its own, was the most freedom I had ever known. The quiet arrived slowly then, all at once. It wasn't dramatic. There were no final conversations, no closure speeches, no sudden forgiveness. There was just a morning when I woke up and realized my phone hadn't buzzed overnight. No missed calls, no anxious messages, no demands disguised as concern. The silence felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a room where the noise had finally stopped echoing. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the city wake up. Cars moved steadily below. Someone walked their dog. Life continued, indifferent to the chaos that had once felt so consuming. For the first time in years, my chest didn't tighten at the thought of the day ahead. Peace, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly when nothing is trying to take something from you. Time passed. Not in a neat cinematic way, but in the ordinary rhythm of days stacking on top of each other. Work, errands, evenings that belonged to me alone. The legal process continued in the background, slow and procedural, but it no longer defined my emotional weather. I didn't check updates obsessively. I didn't wait for outcomes to feel justified. I had already crossed the line that mattered. There were moments of grief. I won't pretend there weren't. Holidays came and went quieter than they used to be. I saw families gathered in restaurants laughing over shared plates and felt a familiar ache rise in my throat. Not for my parents or my sister as they were, but for the idea of family I had spent my life trying to earn. That grief surprised me with how clean it felt. It didn't come with guilt. It didn't ask me to fix anything. It simply reminded me that wanting something doesn't make it real. I stopped confusing loss with failure. For years I had believed that keeping the peace was the same as being loving, that enduring discomfort was proof of maturity, that saying yes even when it hurt was a kind of virtue. Walking away forced me to confront how wrong that had been. Love that requires access isn't love, it's leverage. Money was never the point. Not really. It was the tool, the excuse, the pressure point they understood best. What they wanted wasn't just funds, it was control. The ability to decide for me, to override my judgment, to treat my boundaries as temporary inconveniences. When that control disappeared, so did the relationship. That truth was painful, but it was also clarifying. I thought often about the moment at the table, the red screen glowing between us, the realization settling over their faces. Not with satisfaction, but with understanding. That moment didn't feel like revenge. It felt like an ending that had been delayed too long. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped protecting a version of it that didn't protect me. There is a strange freedom that comes from knowing you don't have to explain yourself anymore. I didn't need to justify my decisions to people who had already decided who I was to them. I didn't need to soften my words or anticipate reactions. My life became simpler not because it was empty, but because it was honest. I started filling my time with things that had nothing to do with survival. Long walks, books I read slowly, conversations that didn't carry hidden agendas, relationships built on mutual respect instead of obligation. Stability, it turned out, wasn't loud. It didn't demand proof. It just existed. Sometimes late at night I thought about answering if my phone ever rang again. I imagined what I might say if my sister called, or if my parents tried one last time to rewrite the story. I played those conversations out in my head, then let them go. The power to say no doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop bleeding. If you've made it this far, maybe something in this story felt uncomfortably familiar. Maybe you've been the responsible one, the dependable one, the person everyone turns to when things fall apart. Maybe you've been told that protecting yourself is selfish, that boundaries are cruel, that family should always come first. I want to ask you something. Where would you draw the line? Not where you think you should. Where you actually would. What would it take for you to say no and mean it? If this story stirred something in you, I'd really like to hear it. Share your thoughts, your experiences, or even the questions you're still wrestling with. You're not alone in them, even if it feels that way sometimes. And if stories like this matter to you, if you want to keep exploring what happens when truth finally replaces silence, consider staying here. There are more stories to come, and each one exists for the same reason this one does. To remind you that dignity is not something you earn by enduring pain. It's something you claim the moment you decide you're done paying for other people's comfort with your own peace. That choice changed my life. And if you're standing on the edge of a similar decision, I hope this story helped you see that whatever you choose next, you're allowed to choose yourself.